Welcome to the Bridge Builder Program, an initiative of the Minnesota Catholic Conference where we help you live your faith in the public arena. I'm Jason Adkins, Executive Director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and joining me is our producer and Minnesota Catholic Conference Communications Manager, Kit Zapiniak. Hey, Kit.
Everyone, thanks for tuning in again this week. We're so glad that you are able to join us now online on our YouTube channel and over the radio or even on your favorite podcast app. Remember, if you ever miss an episode, just find us online. Go to mncatholic.org/podcast. Jason, I know we've got a great interview ahead. You want to tell our guests a little bit about it?
Yes, we'll be joined today by Dr. Joseph Capizzi. He is the director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. We're going to be talking about what it means to build a healthy, humane ecology, what that is, and what some of the challenges that are posed to that by big tech and the emerging security state, among other things. It's going to be a great conversation.
Wonderful. It does sound like it's a really big topic, but I'm excited to kind of dig into it and really learn a little bit more. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. So everyone, remember, whether you're watching online or listening, you can always send me your discussion ideas, and maybe then tune in the next week and maybe we'll be talking about that. So leave us a comment or just send me an email. The address is show@mncatholic.org. And I will be back at the end of the program with this week's action item.
I'm now joined by Dr. Joseph Capizzi. He's professor of moral theology and executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. He is the ordinary professor of moral theology, and he teaches in the area of social and political theory with a special interest in peace and war, citizenship, political authority, and Augustinian theology. He's written, lectured, and published widely on those topics. And he received his bachelor's from the University of Virginia, his master's in theological studies from Emory, and an MA and PhD in theology from the University of Notre Dame. Most importantly, Dr. Capizzi lives in Maryland with his wife and 6 children. Welcome to the Bridge Builder Program. It's great to be with you, Dr. Capizzi.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, outstanding. Tell us, first of all, though, about the Institute for Human Ecology. I think that's doing some really interesting work. And what should our readers know about that?
We are an institute that's 6 years old at Catholic University, and our mission really is to study the conditions of human flourishing. That's really what human ecology is about. The kinds of conditions that are present in societies that help human beings flourish as they're supposed to. And of course, we attend as well to the impediments, the things that are obstacles to human flourishing. And we do this from a variety of disciplines, primarily politics, theology, philosophy, and economics, but from all of the disciplines. So we get to think about a lot of different things: beauty, art, the political conditions of our culture, literature, all sorts of challenges. And we bring undergraduates, graduate students, faculty from outside the university together around these issues. It's a very exciting mission that we have.
If you're going to take on the difficult task of promoting human flourishing, it seems that you need to make assertions about what's true, what's good, and what's beautiful. Absolutely. And that might be the most controversial dimension of your work, especially vis-a-vis the broader culture. What is the challenge in terms of promoting? I think the vision of a healthy human ecology is an attractive one, but it could be a way of evangelizing and engaging people who might not otherwise be inclined to listen. But what are some of the challenges in asserting truths and proclaiming that certain things are good and that certain things are bad, both within the church, but also to a wider culture as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to some extent, my answer to, what are the challenges depends upon my mood. There are many. Look, there are many. First of all, there are many challenges. But in a way, our approach is to speak in terms of opportunities. And I think we have unique opportunities that are present to us. Like you spoke about truth, right? And typically people will just, start a harangue about, we live in a post-truth culture and so on. Of course, that's true. But part of what's interesting about our culture is that even though a lot of people, sort of accept this idea that, we're in a post-truth world, even that phrase, right, is sort of making the claim about the the good of the true, right? The good of truth, a kind of longing for truth. And so what we try to do is enter into the middle of conversations in an appealing way, a positive way, and say, yes, we get it. Like, we all are striving to understand true things. And we take those opportunities. We do it, I hope, with civility and some measure of grace, and try to engage people where they are, people from different perspectives. We don't compromise on our views, but generally we've had very positive conversations. We've had positive longer term engagements with people around ideas that interest them and us, and where we can build the kind of common ground to move our culture forward.
What do you propose are the cornerstones of a healthy human ecology?
Well, look, the first thing is truth, right? I mean, the first thing is the real, right? Identifying things that we take as givens from which we can build a society, right? Build families, build local communities. And so the first thing is just to try to name and identify these givens that we share. And obviously there are challenges around this, right? Even certain biological givens that in the past we all took for granted right now are, kind of up in the air. People are raising questions about them. So truth is a key component of that. Another component of it is freedom. However you think about the issue of freedom, and there are obviously varieties of positions, freedom is a great human good. Everybody has recognized that. Scripture itself recognizes the good of human freedom. And the Catholic perspective on freedom connects itself to truth, right? So we recognize freedom as a good. We do our best to try to promote it in its contact with what is in fact is true, and try to preserve it. So that's another, sort of given. From my own studies, a particular interest here would be something like order, security, justice, right? The sort of principles of life in political community that often we take for granted, right? We just sort of assume that they'll be there. During the pandemic, we've had challenges to it, and we can see how challenging order and security and justice, even in a country that's as well formed as the United States historically has been, especially by comparison to others, right? Just challenging it severely upends people, causes anxieties, it causes discord, right? And all of a sudden, this thing that we've taken for granted for so long, now we realize its value. So those are just some of the constituents of what flourishing that needs.
When we're talking about ecology, Pope Francis notes in Laudato Si the interconnectedness of things. And it seems that one of the great blessings that the Catholic Church can bring to the discourse is putting back together, reintegrating what politics and the culture want to pull apart. What are some of the key things that you're doing at the Institute to kind of put things back together? And maybe one example would be talking about the family, for example, and thinking about the ways in which economics impacts the family. So integrating a traditionally progressive or liberal concern with social conservatism at the same time. That's
right. I mean, it's a great way to describe it, right? We're trying to reintegrate what has been disintegrated, or what is always moving towards a kind of disintegration. And the first thing, of course, we're a university, right? And so as an institute within a university, the first thing we do is we try to reintegrate the disciplines, right? So pull together different disciplines so they can attend to these issues from their unique perspectives, from the perspective of history or English literature or philosophy, theology, politics, economics, law, right? We're trying to reintegrate these things. The disintegration that we see across our culture, right, expresses itself in different ways. And one of them is one you touched on, right, which is to sort of separate out economics as a kind of unique concern, a science that is impenetrable from other perspectives. And as we know from the classical philosophical tradition, economics starts out as a branch of the philosophical tradition of political and philosophical reflection. We try to reintegrate that. And the family is a great locus for seeing the interconnectedness of parental responsibility within the home, of the flourishing of families, the having of children, the relationship of that to ongoing communities, to communities' own conceptions of themselves as enduring realities, right? The communities think of themselves as essentially immortal. It's hard not to think that, right? And of course, having more children, having healthy families contributes to that. So it's reintegrating it in precisely the ways that you've indicated.
When we, I get probably too wrapped around the pole about this, but I think it's really fascinating that how economics, ecology, they have that Greek root, the oikos, in them, the household.
That's right.
Is that maybe a bridge in terms of thinking about the interconnectedness of these things, or thinking about how we, build society, build a healthy ecology, build a healthy economic system, starting with the household, the family, and not the individual? Is that perhaps a key to unlock some of the challenges we face?
It is. And of course, from the Catholic perspective, following the Aristotelian perspective, we think of the human being as a social being, right? As a being for whom the social is an essential component of what we are, right? We are people in communion, we would say, from a theological perspective. So a community, right, that is particularly intimate to all of us is family. And it has served in political reflection for centuries as a model of, or even an analog to, political community, and the capacity of going back and forth between thinking about, like, for instance, political authority in relationship to parental authority has always been an important value. And actually, some have argued, and I think rather convincingly, that the crisis of authority that we're actually experiencing too, which is one of our impediments to human flourishing, is related in part to the demise of parental authority, or almost like the unintelligibility of parental authority in communities that are increasingly individual oriented. They can't quite understand how parental authority operates, and then all of a sudden you lose this critical model for thinking about how political authority operates, right? So there's challenges there, and again, opportunities.
Yeah, I'm just really moved by that. The collapse in parental authority, and the crisis of authority generally in society. I think that merits a lot of more thought and discussion. So thank you for raising that point, Dr. Capizzi.
Sure.
The humane ecology. Sometimes you hear words like human scale when we're discussing a humane ecology. Thinkers like E.F. Schumacher, small is beautiful. But what is the intersection between thinking about human scale environments, particularly the built environment, business, various enterprises, even churches, big churches, or maybe something a little bit smaller and more localized? What's that interaction between human scale thinking, or people who've been proposing things like that, and a really humane ecology?
Yeah, look, I in a way, I think we'd have to go a little bit more deeply, moving forward into what the church sees about these kinds of questions, or what is revealed in Scripture, right? What we understand to, like, sort of theologically be revealed. And a lot of the movement of the past century or so has been to sort of focus on the human being, right, as the locus of revealing meaning, right, for how societies should form themselves and the values that they should pursue. And there's great advantages in doing that, right, in thinking in terms of the human being as the measure, in other words, of all things good. From our perspective, right, from the Christian perspective, we think of the human being particularly as revealed in Christ, right? It's not merely the human being that we can study through the empirical sciences, even philosophically and so on, but it's actually this being that is revealed to us in Christ, in Scripture, in the life of Jesus Christ, in the the community that has worshipped Him and for now millennia, all as a reaction, obviously, to certain developments in the 19th century and early 20th century that seem to lose focus on the person, right? But what you're seeing with Pope Francis, and I think you see it also in Benedict and in later encyclicals of John Paul II, is while this focus has been great and a kind of corrective, one of the deficiencies of it has been the detachment of the human being from the world he inhabits, right? The world that the human being inhabits, and the world as a created world, right? As something given to us by a good and gracious God. And that's what human ecology is, as I understand it, is trying to correct for, right? Let's reattach the human being, replace the human being in the spaces that he occupies, right? The spaces in which he finds his flourishing. And its connectedness, the connectedness of the human being as a corporate, or a social being, to the world of which he is part, as a creature. And so there's been a kind of emphasis, or re-emphasis, especially, of course, you see it in Laudato Si, to which you referred, on our place in an order that is much larger than we are. And then the kinds of questions which you probably even know more than I do about like human scale and so on would really be derivative of that replacement of the human person into creation, of which we are a special part, but still a part.
It's like talking about the difference between humans inhabiting an environment, or as
That's
humans living within an ordered creation in relationship to things and creatures around him or her.
Right.
What, speaking of humane ecology, it seems that Pope Francis and Benedict, like you mentioned, really mentioned right relationship as the essential to understanding human ecology, but more and more we seem detached from the producers who produce the things we consume by impersonal forces, big government, big tech, big business. It's becoming more and more impersonal, especially as we migrate to DoorDash, online ordering. I mean, it's just everything seems to be getting more and more impersonal. What's going on there? We were talking about right relationships, but we seem to be disconnecting from each other in a human way. And of course, the pandemic, for obvious reasons, has almost seemed to fuel that.
Yeah. Yeah. The language of impersonal, right, could also be substituted out for like the language of unnatural, right, in essence. And I think you and I probably should have we should dwell on this for a little bit and have a conversation, because this is super complicated, right? To some extent, it's super complicated in ways that neither of us could capture, right? We need other people involved in a conversation like this. But one thing that's striking to me, of course, is to some extent, you mentioned DoorDash. To some extent, it's a feature or a consequence of our choices. We're making choices for these things, So we as persons are making choices for things that are arguably increasingly impersonal, as you put it, right? It's not like this is happening by forces, as a consequence of forces that are beyond human action, right? It's human action that is contributing to this, and it's contributing in manifold ways, right? One is simply the choice to stay at home and order in, and have somebody else bring you your food rather than go to the restaurant or cook for yourself and your family, right? Look, there's really good reasons why we do these things, right? It's convenient. You can bring a world of restaurants into your home or something. But if it is in fact impersonal, it has arguably at its root, personal action, right? Some personal action. Now, one could argue that, look, there are larger structures that are inducing us to act in these ways, right? And maybe you might be interested in advancing that argument, right? But that at that point, at some point, we're going to be talking about, are we free or not, right? Is there free agency here, or is the space for free agency becoming increasingly constricted? So that's one. Look, I think that's like one component of how to begin to think through the question you raised. On the other hand, there are just these sort of interesting developments, again, that we seem to be somewhat complicit in, where we're making choices, or we seem inclined to favor certain ways of engaging each other that are distant in some sense, right? And social media is an obvious example of this. I mean, look at you and me right now, right? We're doing this virtually. On the one hand, right, it facilitates a conversation that you and I could not have in this way, except for having to travel to see each other, which is much less convenient and more costly in certain respects, right? It makes this much more available to people than it might otherwise be, and available, almost in perpetuity. But on the other hand, we both know that there's no conversation, or at least we know, I think we know, there's no conversation like the personal conversation where we're physically present to each other, capable of reading each other's body language, capable of seeing those moments when you want to cut me off and I want to cut you off, and and you kind of diminish your speaking in order to allow the other person an entree into it. But why are we choosing these things, or are we choosing these things? There are, as you know, people who argue we're not, right? I think of Jacques Ellul or Hans Jonas, these late 20th century, mid-late 20th century critics of technology who argue that increasingly human beings are subjects of a technological momentum that they can't resist, right? So, I might think we're free or freely choosing these things. These guys would argue, well, you're not actually, right? Right. There's a momentum here to technological progress that is impersonal, that is irresistible.
In what way, you mentioned the conveniences that tech provides, and oftentimes it seems that the calculus as to the choices we make, most especially consumer choices, is often rooted in maximizing short-term utility. So we're always acting for the good, but it's perhaps short-sighted and very utilitarian in terms of how things are useful to us in the moment. Whereas it seems that building a culture built in right relationships requires a different kind of intentionality with higher values and choices that are ordered toward particular goods. Now, there's no shortage of cultural criticism in the Catholic world about lamenting the state of things, but there are people out there, and they're not always Catholic, and in many cases they aren't, who are making, real intentional choices about consumption and other things that are elevating higher values and deeper relationships, even if sometimes we view them as disordered. You can even think in terms of as crass as the craft beer movement. People eschewing mass production and supporting, local breweries or even, farmers markets or things like that, paying higher prices, but being connected to the producers of those foods, or supporting people who are producing higher quality content, beer, for example. And even though it's going to cost more, they can go to a beer hall and be in relationship with people. It's social. You're supporting a smaller producer. There's a connectedness there. And even if they're not thinking of that in terms of the way we would think about right relationships, there's something to that. So what, in your experience, helps people get outside of even, Catholics just prone to embrace a short-term utility maximization when it comes to their use of tech, to think about things perhaps at a higher level of intentionality and at the question of the good?
Yeah. Right, there are really fascinating movements that are occurring, right? Some of them are things like the Bruderhof, right?
Bruderhof, yeah. We've had Peter Mommsen on the show. Yep.
Right. I mean, there are these really fascinating stepping outsides of the stream or the momentum of our culture that are occurring at that level. Some of the stuff you talked about, I can't help myself. This is a little bit of sort of blue collar roots or something, or the union label roots. It's a little class privileged, right? Because as you said, if I can afford a $5 beer, and a craft beer, I might do it in part by sort of justifying it, or even thinking of it in terms of I'm stepping outside of the Anheuser-Busch, stream of mass-produced beer that is, much cheaper. But that's a privilege to be able to operate intentionally in that way, and we have to be, careful as one, sort of thinks through one's own moral choices and so on. What's happening here? Am I just consuming differently, right? Am I actually just consuming differently, or am I actually doing the sorts of intentional, habit-changing activity that I think you're pointing towards? And that's the key to me, right? Is that what has to be happening here is a kind of rehabituation into the way we engage the world. And I think, again, this is what you're seeing in Francis and Benedict and so on, is that we need to rehabituate ourselves, because a lot of the forces that are operating in our lives really are habituating us into consumers and into not merely consumers in the crass way you mentioned, right, which we're all very familiar with. And again, I think technology is like the best example of this because it's just so oriented towards obsolescence, right, and reproduction. But it's not merely consumers in that respect. It's consumers almost holistically, right? One of the things I've noticed, I'm sure you have as well, is reading. The way people read is a kind of consumptive practice now, right? So it's not simply, reading for the good of engaging the world and being open to different ideas, but reading for the good of, I put a book on my shelf, I consumed it, and now I can spit it out in a conversation, or maybe not even, but I've just simply engorged on it, in a way I would a Big Mac or a craft beer. So I think the key here is really rehabituation, but that comes again in part from what is real, a confrontation with the real, with the true, that challenges the way we're seeing the world, the way we're engaging the world, and invites us now to say, I've got to do this differently, right? There's a reason to do this differently because it is disordered ultimately.
Just applying that same calculus to our use of technology, what might be two questions people ask themselves before they start using or habitually use a particular device or platform, or just in terms of fostering right relationships and not getting sucked into a more deeply impersonal dynamic?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question as a parent. You mentioned I'm a parent of 6, and it's a question I put to my children. And they could easily put to me because I consume, technology as much as they do. And that is like, what good are you getting out of this, right? Identify the good that you're getting from this. And the question arises in part because often we'll engage technology as an instrument, right? And we'll think of it, the sort of classic line, like, look, as an instrument, it's kind of neutral, right? I can use it for good, or I can use it for evil. I can use a shovel either for good, for planting a tree, or I can use it for something, less good or even evil, as an instrument of violence, right? Or to conceal something from other people, to hide a treasure or something. And so we think of, social media, for instance, okay, it's neutral. But I don't think that goes far enough. I think there's something different about, or arguably at least different about social media where, as I ask my kids, like, what is the good that you get out of this? And, they'll offer answers, but they're usually pretty thin. And even in the answering it, they kind of recognize that there's really not much good there, that there's something about this medium, about the way it involves engaging other people. You've used the language of impersonal, that is, it maybe not even merely impersonal, it's arguably anti-personal. Often, I'm sure you've experienced this, people will say, well, geez, the guy's a really good person in real life. Online, she or he, right, is, I don't know what, he's Mr. Hyde at that point, right? And it's like, well, that's really instructive. I mean, I mean, that to me, that's still real life, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's still affecting other human beings, and it's still affecting her or his character, right? So there's something about that medium that I think requires a better response to it than it's neutral and it can be used for good or ill. It's not. Most of these things are not merely neutral, right? They are habit forming. And I think we have to explore those habits and really scrutinize whether they're conducing to our flourishing or diminishing us, and diminishing us not merely as individuals but as communities. And I think the evidence is in. I mean, I think the evidence is pretty clear. Look at what's happening in our republic, right? And a lot of it is social media driven. Not all of it clearly, but a lot of it is.
Dr. Capizzi, I have one final question for you.
Sure.
You had mentioned earlier that, freedom is an important good and an element of human flourishing because we have to freely choose the good and the true. These are key aspects of discipleship. Of course, it's right out of the scriptures.
Right.
But it's clear today, and I'll just editorialize here and say people value security more than freedom, for sure. And I think the pandemic has clarified that. But we've been building in this country for 20 years now, through the technology that big tech offers, a security state, whether it's real ID to help us fly on planes safely, or the surveillance state that has been written about on a number of, I think Shoshana Zuboff has a book called The Surveillance State. The pandemic has accelerated that. We're talking about vaccine passports and all of these things. The church, though, when it has focused on discrete issues of analysis, when we talk about the pandemic, it's been the ethics of vaccines. It hasn't said a lot about sort of the civil liberties questions that are at the intersection of the broader, the advent and the continued development of the security state through the apparatus of big tech and what it both provides the government, but also corporations as well. And now we even see a deeper hand in glove dynamic there. How might the church begin to provide or think through an ethical framework for analyzing and responding to this? Because I think we're naturally troubled and concerned by it, but I'm not sure that the theological or ethical framework is there to even evaluate it. It seems that's an area that needs to be developed more and more. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think you're right that this responding to this from a theological perspective, or even more immediately as the church is going to be a really difficult process. And I think you kind of got at part of the difficulty here. There are at least two things that we've not spoken well about in a long time in the church, and there's different reasons for why that's the case. One of those is security, right? You mentioned it yourself. And I mean, I think there's fascinating resources in our tradition for beginning to explore what security is and why it's dangerous to think in its terms, right? I mean, scripture is providential. It's not security oriented. Security, right, if you just think of the language, right, to secure something, right, means to more or less control it, right? And that's not how we approach the world as Christians. We don't approach it seeking control. In fact, we seek, right, we're really encouraged to let go of control of things and to allow God, right, to enter into our lives and to put ourselves in his hands. So there are deep theological resources where we can really begin to disarm this infatuation with security, which is decades old. It's much older than this, but you're right, we're kind of reaching ahead. So that's one aspect of this. I think we've got to explore security. The other one we've talked about earlier, and that's authority. Mm-hmm. We just do not have, we don't have functioning institutions of authority that we can point to as models that are effective, and we can see collapse, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that people haven't already said and haven't been saying for probably a century or longer. We've seen the collapse of authority, and authority is basically like telling, like if you and I were in a relationship of authority, like you trusted me, for instance, as an authority on medicine, and I said, this is why you should take this. You wouldn't need reasons, right? Your trust of me as an authority would move you to do what I tell you in that regard. Most of us don't understand authority in that way any longer, for many different kinds of reasons. We've seen it collapse almost across the board: political authority, military authority, church authority, parental authority, education, right? I mean, like it's all suffering deeply. And because of that, we can't begin to think about in what ways ought political authority act well. You know, what would it mean for political authority to act well? And reconstructing that is going to have to begin almost with theory because of, the deficiencies in practice. And theory is wonderful, and we need to do that. But that's many steps away from getting to where we need to be, where we can think about how do we dismantle what's happening right in front of our eyes, which is really noxious. I mean, the great commentator, Hannah Arendt talks about how and she's controversial for many different reasons, right? And people can disagree with her, but one of the things she describes, and she was describing a crisis of authority in the 1950s, right? That when those crises occur, the paradox, of course, is it disposes people to tyranny, right? It actually prepares you for tyrannical political response. And, I think that's a lot of people's concern, that this is more or less where we are, is we're disposed towards this and looking for that kind of authoritative seeming action. And it's not actually authority, it's something different. It typically is accompanied by violence and, coercion, rather than the instruments that we associate with authority.
When there's no authority, there's just power. And
That's right.
The conflation of the two, that's what one of the challenges we have today.
That's
wow,
right.
A lot to chew on, Dr. Capizzi. Very grateful for this conversation. Dr. Joseph Capizzi, Director of the Institute for Humane Ecology and Professor of Theology at Catholic University of America. Where can our listeners go to learn more, Dr. Capizzi?
Yeah, so you can find the Institute for Human Ecology at IHE.Catholic.edu. That's our website, IHE.Catholic.edu. And yeah, don't hesitate to join us. We're doing good things. Jason, this has been great.
Indeed, it's a great conversation. Thanks for all the work you're doing at the Institute. It's really adding to the discourse within the church and the broader community. Thanks so much for joining us on The Bridge Builder, Dr. Capizzi.
My pleasure, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, and we'll be back in a moment with this week's action item. Welcome back to the Bridge Builder program, an initiative of the Minnesota Catholic Conference where we help you connect your Catholic faith and public life. I'm Jason Atkins, and now we're going to be joined by Kit Sapiniak, our communications manager, who's going to share with us this week's action item. What do you have, Kit?
Yeah, so Sunday, September 26th, marks World Day of Migrants and Refugees. In Minnesota, parishes are marking it as Immigration Sunday. It's an opportunity to get to know and welcome people in their parishes and communities who maybe have recently migrated here, really getting to know all the people who make up our beautiful communities and our parishes. And right now, we really see a lot of people around the world who are fleeing violence and persecution, a lot of natural disasters and economic struggles. They're all searching for hope, and whether it's a lot of newly arriving Afghan families or Hispanic families, we can be those hands of Christ that are really reaching out to those people in need. And we can all agree the situation facing people on our southern border is an absolute crisis, and Congress has to do something to come together to find solutions. So right now in our Action Center, we have an action alert for you to take action, to send a message to your members of Congress, simply asking for them to pass comprehensive immigration reform, asking them to come together and find solutions. So you can find that by going to mncatholic.org/action center, and then click on the Immigration Action Alert. And Jason, oftentimes we'll be asked, why does the church even get involved with immigration issues in the first place?
Well, the main thing is keeping families together. First of all, that's how we think about our challenge and the opportunity here in the United States with so many undocumented persons who are living within our borders, who are likely not going to be deported, who are here with us long term. So how do we both keep those families together and integrate them into our society? But the more we continue to kick the can down the road of comprehensive immigration reform, the more border crises we're going to have. And they seem to be getting worse and worse every year. Something needs to be done. There has to be common ground built for the common good around that question. So it's more urgent than ever for Catholics to encourage their legislators to find that common ground and create comprehensive immigration reform that protects families, keeps them together, provides border security, creates opportunities for worker visas and all those sorts of things, that we have immigration policy that serves the common good.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time for today. So make sure to tune in to our YouTube channel if you're listening online for any extended conversations. We don't always have time each week to get it all into a short half hour. So Make sure when you're online to click subscribe, and then you'll always be notified of our latest episodes. Remember, you can always send us an email or comment. The address is show@mncatholic.org. And you can find any past episodes. Our website is mncatholic.org/podcast.
Whether you've joined us on the radio, online, on YouTube, or in the podcast, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back again next week with another great guest and an important action item for you to connect your Catholic faith and public life. I'm Jason Atkins, and for Kitsapeniak at the Minnesota Catholic Conference, thanks for tuning in. God bless your day.